lines, just $30 each. Click, call, or visit a Spectrum store today.
Even the mighty might not see it coming. It's prediabetes, and it captures 1 in 3 adults. But you can escape. Take the 1-minute prediabetes risk test to know where you stand and prevent or delay type 2 diabetes. Be your own hero on smartphones everywhere at doihaveprediabetes.org.
Spectrum News Plus. Local stories, connecting communities. Streaming now on the Spectrum News app and free with your Spectrum subscription.
I'm Sharon Tazwell. Here's your Spectrum News in 90.
The yeas are 54, the nays are 46. The bill is passed.
The Senate has passed a GOP-backed funding bill averting a government shutdown. He was uncertain if it would pass, but many Democrats opposing the bill in protest of the Trump administration. But Minority Leader Chuck Schumer broke from his party, saying the alternative was worse, and a shutdown would have given the administration free rein to make even more drastic cuts. The bill now goes to President Trump to sign. President Donald Trump addressed the Department of Justice Friday, laying out his vision for the department with a focus on crime and immigration. It's a notable appearance, given that no president has appeared at the Justice Department in a decade. In his opening remarks, Trump said the Justice Department is starting a, quote, proud new chapter in the chronicles of American justice. And millions of Americans bracing themselves for a stormy weekend. An outbreak of severe storms ramping up Friday could spawn tornadoes with the greatest risk in Missouri and Illinois, as well as portions of Iowa, Kentucky, Tennessee, and also Arkansas. And to the south, winds and dry weather pose a critical risk of wildfires in northwest Texas, Oklahoma, and also a portion of southeast Kansas. And that's a look at your Spectrum News in 90.
Welcome to a special edition of The Big Deal. I'm Errol Lewis, national political anchor at Spectrum News. We launched this program last year to focus on the biggest deal there is in America, the future of our country and its people. On today's episode, we're looking back to 5 years ago this week, when the World Health Organization officially declared COVID-19 a pandemic. At the time, there was a lot of uncertainty surrounding the coronavirus, which rapidly spread across all 50 states. It was unlike anything we've ever seen in a century. And before we knew it, schools closed, stores, restaurants, and professional sports all shut down. Hospitals were overwhelmed with sick patients, and thousands died every day. Over the past 5 years, we've lost more than 1.2 million Americans to the virus. The hardest hit states were California, Texas, New York, and Florida, but every community has nightmare stories. And there were more than 100 million reported cases of COVID up until May of 2023, when the World Health Organization declared an end to the pandemic, even though the virus still lives on. We have a packed show for you today on The Big Deal this week, how COVID has dramatically changed America. First, we'll take a closer look at the pandemic's lingering effects on our society, the way that we work, and our education system. Then we'll talk about the many lessons America has learned about how to better protect public health from future pandemics. And then finally, we'll look at the politicization of the pandemic and the lasting influence on American politics. But first, here's how Americans across the country are reflecting on the unprecedented crisis.
I barely remember my life before COVID.
Probably the biggest healthcare crisis in the last 100 years.
A moment in time like no other.
It brought a lot of fears, a lot of isolation.
I had a lot of the symptoms of loneliness.
There were definitely some gaps post-pandemic in math and reading.
We need to be embracing remote work where it makes sense.
Having to stare at a computer screen all day, every day, to actually be able to see someone in person made a big difference.
Renewed appreciation for the importance of community.
I've learned that you can never take anything for granted.
The duration from diagnosis to passing was 14 days.
I'm so grateful that I'm here and I get to watch this little guy grow up.
We knew that we needed to do the best thing we possibly could for our communities and to keep everyone safe.
Really important to remember that something like that can happen at any time.
It's amazing that it's been that long. Seems like yesterday.
Joining me now to talk more about the pandemic's lasting toll is a panel of my Spectrum News colleagues. Alex Cohen is a political anchor for Spectrum News Plus based in Southern California. Jason Fechner is an anchor for Spectrum News 1 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I want to ask both of you fine folks to tell us how you think about the pandemic and how it changed our society over the last 5 years. Let's start with you, Jason.
Errol, great to see you. It's really not an easy question to answer. There are definitely those specific things that we all remember together. The images of those hospitals and morgues, especially in New York, filling up early, stay-at-home orders, of course, across the country, the search for toilet paper, Tiger King on Netflix, even cutting our own hair for a bit with some mixed results. But as the pandemic rolled on, at least here in this country, so much of the healthcare side of the pandemic became really intertwined in American politics. President Trump's almost daily briefings that went on for hours, of course, political defiance to medical professionals and Dr. Fauci and what other doctors were saying at the time, politically fueled distrust, things like social distancing, and eventually the vaccine itself, which data shows helped to bring an end to the pandemic and really greatly lowered the rate of deaths tied to COVID itself. You know, you look at the polling data out there, we were definitely a divided country 5 years ago going into the pandemic. That clearly was accelerated throughout, and it is still definitely there 5 years later now.
And Alex, what's your take on how things have changed since the pandemic?
I agree with Jason wholeheartedly. It's a yes and because I would say, you know, not only was it the pandemic, but really the ascendance of social media happening at the same time. And one of the things that I think in conjunction led to was something known as the social recession. There was one study out of Stanford University, that showed that the pandemic left us with 13 million more single Americans. And I think we're just now really starting to see the full impact of this. The fact that we got used to really isolating, you know, we could kill each other. The people that we loved, being in contact could mean death, and the implications that had for people isolating, not connecting in the same way, and then turning instead to our devices, to these social media platforms where we were getting information as algorithmically, you know, tuned into our thought systems and belief, and the misinformation that was amplified, as Jason mentioned, in terms of science and medicine, in terms of politics. I think we're really beginning to see the full impact of that here in 2025.
And of course, Jason, the pandemic sent shockwaves through the labor market. I remember the early days of the pandemic when businesses shut down all around the country. Millions of people were either out of work or they quit their jobs amid fears of contracting the virus. And then there were those of us who were working from home, the way many of us at Spectrum were broadcasting from our basements and living rooms. 5 years later, where do we stand with remote work?
Yeah, Errol, remote work, remote school, of course, too. God bless all the parents whose kids were going to school virtually for so much of the pandemic. And I was in a studio in a coat closet around the corner here with my feet on a milk crate balancing for months on end. So many Americans became familiar with remote work, their home studios, the lighting, camera angles, obviously making sure that cameras were off when they should be. Some people learned about that the hard way. Now, 5 years later, remote work has become part of our country's employment story out there. Some employers really shifted to fully welcome it moving forward out there. They like having kind of a employment pool across the country where they can hire people from anywhere as they work remotely. Others have more of a hybrid work schedule. It's really in flux right now. In places like Louisiana, the governor there, Jeff Landry, just announced changes to their work from home schedule moving forward. And not far where we are, the head of the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce there told the Star Tribune that moving forward, it's really going to be a spectrum of employment options where remote work will still be a thing for generations to come. Others are staunchly opposed to it, namely President Donald Trump, of course. And quickly, a final note on all this, all that work from home really had an impact on the housing market, and we are still seeing that impact go forward today. Extremely high housing costs out there, very low inventory moving forward. So that is still a ripple effect from the pandemic that continues on now more than 5 years afterwards.
And Alex, just to pick up on some of what Jason was saying, I mean, there's social distancing, there's work from home, there's wearing masks, all of those things divided a lot of communities. Nothing more so, I think, than closing schools that really divided a lot of communities. And 5 years later, what do we know about the lasting effects on students of that?
We know that students suffered. Test scores in subjects like reading and math dropped precipitously during the pandemic. We started to see some of those scores coming back up, but nowhere near where they used to be. And I think what we've learned in all of this, my son's school recently burned down in the fires here in California. And the school was quick to say, we don't know where we're going to be. They've been displaced for months now, but they said we will not go back to online learning because we really saw the harmful effects of this on our kids, on our teachers. We are not going back to that.
Okay, a lot of food for thought there. Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you, Jason. Coming up next, we will take a closer look at the lasting health effects of COVID and the state of our healthcare system. The Big Deal is back in 2 minutes. Stay with us.
We said we'd never break the 3-second rule. Never do that. And never become a minivan mom.
Hey, Chris.
As parents, we say never a lot, but never happens. So when you say you'd never leave your child in a hot car, know it can happen. Before you leave the car, always stop, look, lock.
I really am in the middle of nowhere. Every day is different. Chores, come on, homeschooling, and then I fit in the rug business. I just got a new batch of rugs that I'd love to show you. I have a website, and a lot of what I do is sharing my home life. Mommy's leaving. Reliable, high-speed internet is the foundation of our business. Spectrum was great. They went out of their way to make sure that I was okay and I was taken care of. Shoo! And that's the awesomeness of having Spectrum.
I'm an ex-drug dealer, and I'll be your sub today. Two milligrams of fentanyl can be lethal. A lethal dose is in here. Who gets it, I won't know.
It's cheap, it's potent, and it's profitable.
The sad reality is fentanyl is being mixed into everything now.
Our kitchen now.
You're not gonna get it all right. Just make sure you nail the big stuff.
Mama!
Like making sure your kids are in the right seat for their age and size. Get it right at nhtsa.gov/the-right-seat.
Watching The Big Deal, where we are focusing on the 5-year anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic. Following years of research, scientists are getting a clearer picture of how the coronavirus can affect human bodies after recovery. There's this phenomenon known as long COVID, which can cause more than 200 different symptoms, including fatigue, brain fog, and heart issues. 1 in 20 adults in the United States are estimated to be living with long COVID, but there's still no easy diagnosis and no approved treatment. Joining me now to break it all down and talk about the lessons we've learned from this deadly pandemic is Erin Billups, Spectrum News national health reporter. Great to see you. And Erin, how close are we to getting some kind of a treatment for long COVID?
You know, there really needs to be large clinical trials done because there are millions of people who are suffering with long COVID. Many of them, their symptoms have just not gone away. They're expected to have them for the rest of their lives. And you need money to do those really large clinical trials, and so that doesn't bode well for treatments for long COVID right now. We're seeing funding cuts at the NIH for these sort of big research initiatives. So for the most part, just given the vast array and broadness of symptoms that there are, people are being treated for their individual symptoms, whether it's neurological, whether it's cardiovascular, and that's probably where things will stay for the foreseeable future until we get bigger trials done.
The pandemic really shook up the healthcare industry. At the time, I remember there were doctors and nurses and hospital employees who were deemed essential workers, and they really risked their lives. Some of them lost their lives to sort of fight against COVID on behalf of the rest of us. How would you say that healthcare has changed over the past 5 years?
You know, I think what first comes to mind is we all kind of dealt with some mental health impacts after going through that, from healthcare workers to just everyone, and how their lives were abruptly changed. So we saw sort of what was predicted as like this tsunami of mental health care needs. We saw worsening of chronic diseases because a lot of people were just like, I'm not going to the hospital for a while. It was like a 1.5 year, 2 year period where people were afraid to go into hospitals. So we have later diagnoses of chronic illnesses that we're catching up with, cancers, a type of chronic illness, being diagnosed later. But one of the good things to come out of the pandemic that's sort of changed the healthcare landscape is telemedicine. That was something that was only used in the most rarest of circumstances before the pandemic. Now doctors, hospitals are now utilizing that to keep on top of chronic care patients from afar. This has worked out better for people who live in rural areas, so they're getting better care without having to be in the building.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely the norm now. Spectrum News spoke to the first person to be vaccinated in the U.S., and that was New York nurse Sandra Lindsay. Let's take a listen to that.
I wanted to instill public trust in persons that look like me, who I knew would be less likely to get vaccinated because of mistrust, and who were mostly affected. I also wanted to protect myself and my loved ones. I felt like healing was coming, and I think it marked a significant turning point in the fight against COVID.
That was a momentous day, but if we fast forward to today, you've got vaccine hesitancy and vaccine skepticism that is really on the rise. And why is that?
You know, when we spoke with Sandra Lindsay, she urges the public to not get their health advice from online influencers, from social media. She now heads up public advocacy with Northwell, and they're seeing that a lot. People are getting their advice from people they follow online, and many times those people are not actual experts. So I think that has contributed to vaccine hesitancy, but we can't ignore the fact that there were missteps by public health authorities during the pandemic. Broad messaging that in the end, maybe those weren't the right decisions. You know, it's hard to say in the time of crisis, you know, what was the right decision, but hindsight being 2020, things could have been handled differently, and that led to growing distrust as well.
Well, let's look forward. We see some measles outbreaks. There's some bird flu outbreaks as well. What has all of this taught us about public health?
That it matters who is messaging and where the messaging is coming from. And so I think there just needs to be a more aggressive public health messaging and a rebuilding of trust. The measles outbreak is, I think it's just sort of the beginning. In 2024, there were 285 measles cases. Already it's just March, and there's 222 cases. So we're still sort of at the beginning. We don't know where this is going to go, but fewer people have been having their children vaccinated. You know, about 93% of kindergartners were vaccinated in the last school year. That's down from 95% before the pandemic, and you need about 95% of people vaccinated against measles to keep it from spreading, you know, to get that herd immunity.
Wow, okay, a source of concern. Thanks very much, Erin. We are not done just yet. Coming up next, we will talk about how the pandemic has changed American politics and highlighted the division between the two major political parties. Stay with The Big Deal.
of school-age children across the country, the state of their schools can have a lasting impact on their health and well-being.
The majority of school districts aren't doing comprehensive regular water quality testing.
As CO2 levels rise in a space, cognitive function takes a direct decline.
We visit 2 school districts working to create safe and healthy environments for their students.
Watch Exploring Your Health, Curing Our Classrooms, available on the Spectrum News app.
Starting a business is hard. You have to stay connected at all times.
As we've been growing the studio, Spectrum's been there every step of the way. I'm always able to make the phone call that I need. I'm able to shoot that text message or that email. Every vital piece of equipment that we have here uses Spectrum.
Fast, reliable internet, starting at $40 a month, backed by the Spectrum commitment to keep your business connected.
I tell my son, I love you every single day. I love you. Now, my dad has never said that to me. Not because he doesn't love me, but because culturally it wasn't comfortable for him. Now that he's a grandfather, he says, I love you to my son every time he sees him. My advice to all the fathers out there, forget the cultural restrictions. They grow up way too fast for you to waste even a single precious moment.
Food isn't just fuel to live, it's fuel to grow. My family relied on public assistance to help provide meals for us. These meals fueled my involvement in theater and the arts as a child, which fostered my love for acting. The Feeding America network of food banks helps millions of people put food on the table. When people are fed, futures are nourished. Join the movement to end hunger, and together we can open endless possibilities for people to thrive. Visit feedingamerica.org/actnow.
We're back with this special edition of The Big Deal on the 5-year anniversary of the coronavirus pandemic. 2020 did not just mark an unprecedented health and social crisis, it also exacerbated the existing partisan divide in the United States. And now, 5 years later, there's still a massive gap between Americans when it comes to COVID. A new survey by the Pew Research Center found that a majority of Republicans believe COVID is something we no longer need to worry about, while a majority of Democrats say that COVID is not taken seriously enough. Joining me now with more on how the pandemic has changed politics is Shana Kushner-Gadarian, a political scientist and professor at Syracuse University. She's the author, by the way, of Pandemic Politics, The Deadly Toll of Partisanship in the Age of COVID. Professor, I want to read a section of your book that struck me where you write, and I'm quoting, "Deep partisan polarization created 2 pandemic realities in America, one where the pandemic was taken seriously and one where the pandemic was an inconvenience." And you write that other countries fared better than the U.S. and that here partisan politics made the crisis worse. Why did that happen?
Sure, great question, and thanks for reading the book. So the first thing I would say is, my co-authors and I write in the book that the background of the United States is already pretty challenging for a crisis, right? We have a fragmented federal system. We have a very challenging healthcare system that's deeply unequal. We have inequality in income, but also we have deep political polarization that came through, and doesn't always come through with public health, but did come through in the pandemic. We had one party telling people, the Democratic Party telling people to stay home and that COVID was a risk. And we had Republican leadership, particularly from the White House, telling people COVID isn't a threat. And even if it were a threat, we don't need to respond in such a stark way as lockdowns. Now, I'll say the White House did come along pretty quickly in terms of getting people to stay home, but we saw lots of differences across states based on their leadership in both telling people whether or not they should be afraid of COVID and what were the appropriate responses, both at the individual level and the community level. So we saw these really big differences in what parties were telling people to do and what to be afraid of.
The pandemic also exposed an erosion of public trust in our federal government in particular. Is the spread of misinformation a result of that loss of trust, or was it the cause of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think misinformation was certainly an issue early on in the pandemic. Again, some of this is a lack of information. It was a new novel threat. People don't know what to do with that, and they're looking to their leadership to tell them what to do. It's also the case that there was a lot of changing information really quickly. Should we mask? Should we not mask? What's the right way to deal with the pandemic? So I think some of that is not necessarily about misinformation, but it was about the lack of information. But there was a whole series of conspiracy theories and a lot of misinformation that was coming partially from the White House and partially from other leaders who were trying to both, again, tell people that they shouldn't be afraid, or that the pandemic was made in a lab, it was a kind of a bioweapon. These kinds of conspiracy theories aren't very helpful. I think misinformation predates the pandemic, but I think you saw an acceleration of it, and you saw an acceleration particularly on one side of the political spectrum.
Okay, so now coming back to 2025, President Donald Trump has picked a vaccine skeptic, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, a critic of pandemic lockdowns, now leads the National Institutes of Health. Where does that put our nation in terms of being prepared to handle the next pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we are not in a very strong position, not just because of the leadership at these agencies, which is troubling, but I think more generally because some of the funding from National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation that was going to doing pandemic preparedness, studying vaccine attitudes, those have been stopped from the recent changes at NIH. And I think that in itself is troubling. There's been a kind of a lack of interest in data collection and surveillance on areas around pandemics. And this will be a problem as we see potentially avian flu becoming more of an issue if it's kind of jumping to people soon. And we don't always know what the next pandemic is. It's also likely that climate change is likely to make pandemics worse. And there's, again, a skepticism about studying and taking seriously the threat of climate change. So I think while we have the tools to be prepared for a pandemic, we don't necessarily have the leadership who is taking that as a serious threat as they're turning their attention to other threats.
Okay, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Gadarian. And we thank all of you for joining us for this episode of The Big Deal. We'll see you next week. Stay tuned to your local Spectrum station.
Friday nights, The Big Deal with Errol Lewis, where Spectrum News' local political journalists break down the most important issues shaping our nation.
Our journey towards improving mental health doesn't always present a clear path. Every Thursday on Your Mental Health, we listen to voices across our communities, discussing the challenges of everyday life and presenting accessible resources to guide us along the path to our well-being, providing hope and empowering choices that light the way to a healthier you.
Your Mental Health with Dr. Nicole Clark, Thursdays on Spectrum News Plus, available on all your favorite devices.
It's game time at the arena, and 20,000 fans are looking for a win. With an ultra-high-speed network and seamless Wi-Fi, fans can get in the door fast and share the game's best moments in real time. And with Spectrum Business committed to keeping them connected 100% of the time, they won't miss a second of the action. A secure, reliable connection from Spectrum Business means the fan experience is a guaranteed win.
Whether it's our stories, the warmth of our laugh, or our family's secret sauce, we all bring something different to the table. So make some space. The power of connection is waiting right outside your comfort zone. Learn how you can help strengthen your community at belongingbeginswithus.org/teamup.
Weather can be beautiful, inconvenient, and at times powerful. And it affects everything we do. At Spectrum News Plus, our weather experts update you with the information and the context you need so you can better plan your day. And we do it every 10 minutes. We're the calm in the storm. Weather on the Ones on Spectrum News Plus, exclusively on Spectrum. And get your weather anytime on the Spectrum News app. Spectrum News Plus, local stories, connecting communities. Streaming